Literary themes in poetry. Students, welcome to our video module for today's class. Today we're going to be looking at two female American poets, one by the name of Emily Dickinson, a poet who lived in the 19th century, and the second one a poet by the name of Sylvia Plath, who lived in the 20th century. Both of their lives were extremely different in certain ways, and their poetry is certainly extremely different. But there's a couple points of similarity. Both of them are American, both of them are women, both of them wrote about the theme of death. And so those are places where we're going to look a little bit in our comparison. We will first look at Emily Dickinson's poem, Because I Could Not Stop for Death, which deals with the personification and a rather genteel view of death. And then we'll look at Sylvia Plath's Lady Lazarus. And in that poem, we see death in a very different way. It should be noted biographically that Sylvia Plath committed suicide, and her poems, the two that we look at, Lady Lazarus and Daddy, today, are both rather raw. It's pretty clear to see that the person who wrote these poems is not having a good time of it and is suffering emotional trauma, and certainly it comes through in the poems, and it's easy to see. And also, if you follow the history, the poems were written only a few months before Sylvia Plath took her life. They were actually published posthumously in a volume called Ariel. Another similar point, Emily Dickinson, although she wrote a copious amount of poems during her lifetime, close to 2,000, I believe 1,800 poems, she only published about less than 10 of them during her lifetime. And actually, she had instructed her sister on her deathbed that she should burn all of her poems. And the sister, fortunately, did not heed that advice and did not burn them. And so the poems were saved for posterity. Otherwise, we would not have them. So we have kind of a delicate and difficult scenario here. As I said, two women who wrote about death. So why don't we begin? We'll begin by looking at Dickinson's Because I Could Not Stop for Death. As I said, Dickinson was a female poet. She lived in Amherst, Massachusetts. It might be important to note that Massachusetts in the mid-1800s, which is the time when she was writing, had a kind of a renaissance of poetic creation. There was a movement known as transcendentalism that had to do with kind of nature, somewhat similar in certain respects to Romanticism in England, but transcendentalism was a bit more philosophical. If you remember in our study of Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey, Wordsworth had this kind of pantheistic sense about him, and the transcendentalists were, trying to get past some of the limitations of society. There are some interesting parallels to be made with the Romantic poets in Britain who existed, probably a generation before them. And as I said, many important thinkers, there were a lot of them at Harvard University at this time, and in the outskirts of Boston, particularly in Concord. You may be familiar with Henry David Thoreau, who wrote the famous tract Walden, where he went and stayed at Walden Pond in the outskirts outside of Boston, and wrote an homage to kind of a life of simplicity and returning to the land. And so that was a current within the poetry and within the philosophical attitudes of the day that defined things. Emily Dickinson lived in Western Massachusetts in Amherst, but her father was a prominent intellectual figure, and there were connections to other important poets and philosophers and thinkers of the day. Emily Dickinson never married. She generally was considered almost like a shut-in. She spent her time gardening and writing poetry, and so that has a certain influence on the type of poetry that she writes as well. As I said, there's a genteel quality to it. So the poem, Because I Could Not Stop for Death, offers us a curious persona and a curious circumstance, right? We talked early in the semester about defining the situation of the poem, and certainly the deathbed sequence of the time We saw that in Donne's valediction forbidding mourning, the beginning of the poem, where there are a group of people waiting in the room with an old man who is dying, a virtuous man passing gently away. That pays homage to these deathbed scenes. Now here we don't have that vividly seen, but we do have the invocation of death and also the personification of death in this particular case. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tool. We paused before the house that seemed a swelling in the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day. I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. So we see in this poem, as I said, a curious scenario. The language and the tone of the poem is quite gentle, considering that it's a poem about death. And in fact, death is personified here. When we see in the first two lines of the first stanza, we have two personal pronouns. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. We actually have a third personal pronoun as well, me. So we have I, he, and me. The I in this poem is obviously the persona, the speaker in the poem. And we gather that this is a feminine figure for a number of reasons. Death is the other character in this poem, and he is personified as a male. And there's a particular kind of male here. Very often the image when we do personify death, the image is a rather macabre one. Typically the idea of the grim reaper, some sort of wearing a dark cowl and having a skull. But here, the person in the poem does not seem to be this horrific, frightening figure. And in fact, if we look the way he is characterized, the words used to describe him suggest someone polite and kind, right? In fact, in the second line, he kindly stopped for me. So we sense something about this person, death, that is gentle and generous. Now, of course, the beginning of the poem, we start to see the way that the persona is. She is also gentle. The tone of the poem is gentle, but she's going about her life, and suddenly death finds her. And it's almost like she's walking down the road, and he picks her up and gives her a ride. Because I could not stop for death implies that she's living her life, and she was too busy doing whatever the things were that qualified her life, and she was unaware that she needed to stop. And so death stops for her. Because she could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. And as I said, that adverbial usage there of kindly stopping implies generosity and civility on the part of death. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We see here the carriage, okay, so she's perhaps walking and death is riding in this carriage. Again, this is the 1860s, so the automobile doesn't exist yet, but the carriage here is probably a horse and carriage. And at this point, this almost seems like a scenario, a man and a woman, perhaps a chaperone, or taking care of her. The man in the picture here is, gently stopping and picking her up and giving her a ride in this carriage. We slowly drove. He knew no haste. There's no impatience here. There's a calmness, a quietness, and a gentleness. And I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. His civility, again, the way he's being described to us is in gentleman-like terms. He's civil, he's kindly, he's compassionate, he's caring. And so all of these things are sort of at odds with the way we might frequently view death. As I said previously, Dickinson was famous for being a bit of a shut-in. She didn't go out. And so here we have the speaker in the poem who seems to have been kind of lured out. She seems to be going for a stroll, and she seems to be unaware that death is interested in her. So he kindly stops for her, picks her up, and brings her, puts her into his carriage to give her a ride. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. It's almost like immortality is the lure to get her out. And so we actually have a threesome here. We have death, we have the speaker, and we have immortality sitting there, riding behind them, perhaps watching them. I'd used the image of the chaperone before, which of course in the 19th century, a young woman of good repute would certainly not go off with a gentleman on her own without someone watching over them. And so this is kind of the tone here. So immortality is sitting over them. And we start to realize that what we have here has this very calm, slow progression that sounds almost like a funeral cortege, where you're going from, you have a hearse taking a person typically from the church to the graveyard to be buried. And so this rapid sense, no sense of urgency whatsoever. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. It's kind of interesting how the poem has a very simple rhythm to it initially. The phrasing is also simple. Again, we've talked about that with the Romantics, this sense of an accessibility, that poetic diction should not be exclusive, should not make people feel that they do not belong and that they cannot understand. So here we have a certain directness and simplicity. And we see that the speaker in the poem is kind of slowly relinquishing her earthly existence. And that line, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too. My labor and my leisure is kind of a full encapsulation of human existence in a certain sense. Your labor, the work that you do, and your leisure, the things you do when you're not working. And so she has traded that in for this ride with the personified death and his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Again, it feels like there's this also a sense of progression in life. We passed the school. We passed the fields. We passed the sun. We can almost see this as childhood, adulthood, coming to the end of adulthood, the end of life, right? We've seen the setting sun, that metaphor, to be equated with death throughout the semester, going back to Shakespeare and Milton in the 1600s, where the end of the day, the diurnal cycle, is very closely allied and associated with the life cycle. And so the setting sun becomes the end of the day, obviously, and it also becomes the end of the life. That reiteration in this stanza, we passed, we passed, we passed, gives it a certain urgency, even though it's a slow, steady urgency. And so we arrive at the end and we have the setting sun that we passed. So everything is fading into the background, into the distance. And here, this is the midpoint in the poem, and we kind of have a strange shift, an abrupt shift here in the beginning of the next stanza, or rather, he passed us. And once again, he, the pronoun, this time referring to the sun. So we passed the sun, or the sun passed us. And suddenly we shift into a different mode, and the calmness and the fluidity of the first three stanzas seems to be a bit more, it's replaced by something else, something a bit more jarring in the upcoming stanzas. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. Now here we see these are kind of outdated, or at least archaic terms for fabric and clothing, tippet and tulle and gossamer. You have types of fabric, gossamer and tulle, and you have types of clothing. A tippet is kind of like a shawl, and her gown. And so we have a description of the way that she's dressed. And it almost seems she's dressed with this very diaphanous, very light fabrics, probably more appropriate for a wedding than a funeral. In other words, she's inappropriately dressed for the situation. And of course, what we see is that she's unprepared in the way she was dressed. She was going out for something else. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. She was busy doing the things she thought she had to do, unaware that she was going to die. And now we notice that the sun has passed them, and now it's growing dark. And life and civilization is being left behind, and it's starting to be slightly a creepier tone. The dews drew quivering and chill. It's cold. Quivering here is an autonomy, because it's not the dew necessarily that's quivering. The dew is the condensation that lies on the grass when the temperature grows a little colder. But obviously it's relating also to the speaker, who is quivering because she is cold, because she's underdressed for the circumstance. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. The rhyme scheme has gone from something fluid and gentle to something kind of jarring, off rhymes. The rhythm of the poem kind of shifted at that midpoint. We have ground rhyming with ground, right? The rhyme scheme just grinds to a halt here, basically. And what we see is she's coming up on her trajectory. They're reaching the point that they were, the destination where they were going, and she imagines still that there's going to be, we have a circumstance where there might be festivity or something celebratory. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Sounds like we don't really have a building here. The roof was scarcely visible, swelling of the ground. We realize we're coming to a graveyard, and the building and the destination that she thinks she's going to is in fact a grave. And we have a hole in the ground dug with the dirt piled up beside it. Since then 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day. I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. And it continues in that final stanza. The rhythm of it is slightly off. It's almost as if the woman speaking in the poem has lost control from that first half of the ride, where it seemed calm, casual, gentlemanlike, accompanied by this friendly personified death, to the gothic kind of horror story of arriving at the graveyard and being aware of it, right? Because in the last stanza, you get a sense of the emotional trauma and the fear that the speaker has. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day. I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. And so we've had this image in the beginning of the poem alluding to immortality, and now we have the perspective in the poem that from this point, it's now centuries in the past. So there really is some kind of immortality. If you remember in Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, where we talked about the urn outliving humanity and coming back and having different generations come and comment on it. Here we have this sense of eternity, but the eternity is some macabre reality where the speaker is in the grave and seems to be speaking to us from the grave, and in fact has stayed there for centuries. But it feels like an instant, since then 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day. Right? She's recounting this day. The whole poem is that day, the day that she died, the day that she went to the graveyard. And now she's looking back on it from this perspective, far removed, deep into the future, towards eternity. So we'll move rather brusquely now towards the second poem that we will compare with Dickinson's Because I Could Not Stop for Death, which is a poem by Sylvia Plath entitled Lady Lazarus. The first, probably the most important reference that you'll need in order to make sense of this poem is the allusion made in the title, Lady Lazarus. Lazarus is a figure in the New Testament in the Gospel according to John, where Jesus comes upon this person who has been dead for 4 days, and he brings him back to life, kind of an image of resurrection, much like what happens with Jesus when he is crucified and comes back on the third day. So we have a sort of a parallel image of him resuscitating Lazarus. And so the image of Lazarus is somebody who comes back from the dead. Lady Lazarus is obviously a female version of the biblical Lazarus, who is a male. And it also has a strong autobiographical thread. One of the things about Plath's poetry is that it is pointedly autobiographical. Most of her famous poems were written in a very short period of time towards the end of 1962. She had just separated from her husband, himself a famous poet by the name of Ted Hughes. He was a British poet, and so Plath is an American from the Boston area. Her father was a professor at Boston University, and she grew up as kind of a very star student and very gifted and talented. And from a very early age, she showed herself to be, capable of great academic and poetic achievement. And so she ended up marrying Ted Hughes, who was a very well-known British poet also. And they were married for, I believe, 7 years. And they had 2 children together. And they had separated. And Plath was in a relatively deep state of depression. And as I said previously, she shortly thereafter committed suicide, but for a span of about 6 months, she wrote an enormous amount of poetry, and most of her famous poems date from that period. And this one, the 2 that we're going to look at today, Daddy and Lady Lazarus as well, date from that period, and they were published posthumously in a volume called Ariel and Other Poems. Ariel is a figure from Shakespeare's The Tempest, a magical figure, and she also wrote a very well-received autobiographical memoir entitled The Bell Jar. So she was a very prolific writer, although she died quite young. And so the poem here, as I said, has currents of autobiography to it. Let us call the poem. So one of the things about the poem that is autobiographical is that Plath, before she succeeded in committing suicide, she had made several suicide attempts previous to that were unsuccessful, and that is what is chronicled in the poem. And so we have this very first-person, somewhat autobiographically inspired poem talking about the experiences of the speaker. And the context of this is probably dealing with mental hospitals and psychiatrists who are trying to help her after she has come through these attempts. And that's the feeling that we get with the Lady Lazarus. You may notice that towards the end of the poem, the figure has the persona in the poem has a dynamic, intense quality about her. I have done it again. 1 year in every 10, I manage it. A sort of walking miracle. My skin bright as a Nazi lampshade. My right foot a paperweight. My face a featureless fine Jew linen. Peel off the napkin. Oh, my enemy, do I terrify? The nose, the eye pits, the full set of teeth. The sour breath will vanish in a day. Soon, soon the flesh the grave cave ate will be at home on me. And I, a smiling woman. I am only 30, and like the cat I have 9 times to die. This is number 3. What a trash to annihilate each decade. What a million filaments the peanut-crunching crowd shoves in to see. They unwrap me hand and foot, the big striptease. Ladies and gentlemen, ladies. These are my hands, my knees. I may be skin and bones, nevertheless I'm the same identical woman. The first time it happened I was 10, it was an accident. The second time I meant to last it out and not come back at all. I rocked shut as a seashell. They had to call and pick the worms off me like sticky pearls. Dying is an art. Like everything else, I do it exceptionally well. I do it so it feels like hell. I do it so it feels real. I guess you could say I have a call. It's easy enough to do it in a cell. It's easy enough to do it and stay put. It's the theatrical comeback in broad day to the same place, the same face, the same brute, amused shout, a miracle that knocks me out. There's a charge for the eyeing of my scars. There's a charge for the hearing of my heart. It really goes. And there is a charge, a very large charge, for a word or a touch or a bit of blood or a piece of my hair or clothes. So, Herr Doctor, so, Herr Enemy, I am your opus, I am your valuable, the pure gold baby that melts into a shriek. I turn and burn. Do not think I underestimate your great concern. Ash, ash, you poke and stir, flesh, bone, there's nothing there. A cake of soap, a wedding ring, a gold filling. Herr God, Herr Lucifer, beware, beware. Out of the ash I rise with my red hair, and I eat men like air. That's a rather distressing poem in a number of ways. As I said, you probably noticed when you read both Lady Lazarus and Daddy that the poet's pain and suffering comes through pretty pointedly. There's a great preponderance of Nazi imagery, both in this poem and in Daddy. I'll probably make some comments that parallel the two poems, and we'll probably only take a very brief look at Daddy at the end of this, depending how much time remains. But these images of Nazi references within the poem are repetitive. She talks about a Nazi lampshade, and later on in the poem she talks about Herr Doctor and Herr Enemy. Herr is an honorific. It's like Sir or Mr. in German. So she's using the German language, and she's making reference to Jews and Holocaust and concentration camps. So that's obviously a relatively unsettling pattern of images to include in the poem. One of the things for Plath is that her father was of German origin. Otto Plath was her father. He was a professor in Boston. He had left Germany, but he spoke German in the house, and probably Plath, growing up during World War II, would have been possibly scarred, or at least very, very self-conscious, because the Americans were at war with the Germans in World War II. And so the idea that she had German background and that her father spoke German was perhaps traumatizing to her. And so she has adopted a strong identification with the Jews, the victims of the Nazi Holocaust, and their desire to exterminate, basically, racial purity and killing all the Jews in the concentration camps in Europe. And so she creates this strange connection to the Jews, as we mentioned here. She's talking about this repetitive efforts to kill herself, her attempts at suicide. I have done it again. One year in every 10, I manage it. So when she was around 10 years old, she tried to kill herself. When she was around 20 years old, she tried to kill herself again. And when she was 30 years old, she tried a third time and actually succeeded. But here she's referring to the previous times, and she's a walking miracle. And again, you see the connection to Lazarus coming back from the dead. She's come back from these suicide attempts, and she has survived. And so she is a sort of walking miracle. Her use of the Nazi imagery is quite distressing as well, and it fits very directly into the context of the death camps that the Nazis established in the efforts to exterminate both the Jews, but also other groups, gypsies, homosexuals, people with disabilities, a broad array of people that they considered to be undesirable. And so the reference to a Nazi lampshade, my skin bright as a Nazi lampshade. The Nazis famously used the skin of some of the Jewish people that they killed in the concentration camps, and they made lampshades out of them, and they made soap out of them, because soap is made from fat. And so they would take the body fat of these people that they had killed, and they would cook it down and use it to make soap. So you see this repeated reference to the sort of the dehumanizing aspect of the Nazi endeavor, where they killed these people and they treated them not as human beings, certainly. So my skin bright as a Nazi lampshade is a reference precisely to that. My right foot a paperweight, my face a featureless fine Jew linen. So she has this association both with this kind of dissecting almost, this breaking down of the physical body into the pieces, the right foot a paperweight, the skin a lampshade, her face a fine featureless Jew linen. And so all of this is, again, very horrific imagery connecting her to the persecuted Jew in the Holocaust context. Now, of course, there's a double context here, because the other one is with these doctors and these people gawking at her. And as I mentioned, there seems to be the feeling of a mental hospital, which if someone commits suicide, very often they will be brought to a mental hospital for psychological observation. And so she is kind of under observation and feeling kind of this voyeuristic reality where these people are looking at her, poking and prodding her, because that's what doctors do when they're trying to figure out what's wrong with you. Now, psychiatrists, doctors that are trying to figure out what's going on inside your head, have a little difficult time, because sometimes the problems that someone has, mental health problems, don't necessarily manifest themselves as visibly. If you have a broken arm or a ruptured appendix, a doctor can, assess your situation and perhaps make an effort to cure you. But when it's your head and the things inside your brain, that body chemistry and other neuropsychological elements of your well-being, those are a little bit more difficult. So she finds herself in this situation, being scrutinized and, as I said, poked and prodded by these people. Peel off the napkin, O my enemy, do I terrify? Okay, you imagine that something is being uncovered, perhaps a wound, okay, and we don't know. The nose, the eye pits, the full set of teeth. The eye pits is kind of curious, because you're talking about the orbits of your eyes, and the way she's describing herself, it almost sounds like a skull. The bone structure and the things that are there without the flesh and without the sort of the person still part of it. The sour breath will vanish in a day. Okay, the breath that doesn't smell very good will be gone. And soon the flesh the grave cave ate will be at home on me. So It's not clear here if we're talking about a regeneration of the flesh or the grave cave eating the flesh. And I, a smiling woman, I am only 30, and like the cat, I have 9 times to die. Obviously, the references to the cat having supposedly 9 lives, and she's used up 3 of them, according to her calculations. This is number 3, what a trash to annihilate each decade. What a million filaments the peanut crunching crowd shoves in to see. Okay, a million filaments. Filaments are the metal wrappings inside of a light bulb or inside of a flash bulb. And so she feels like she's being scrutinized. A million filaments. She's having lights or flashes shined on her so that they can observe her. The peanut crunching crowd shoves in to see. Right? The peanut gallery is often a reference to people, spectators, and usually it's unruly spectators. The peanut gallery are people who make unnecessary comments, who interject their opinions, the peanut gallery, and so they tend to sit in the far seats. So the peanut crunching crowd implies that there's such a large group of people around waiting to see her, to look at her, right? And so she's probably being observed by a team of doctors and psychiatrists and psychologists who are, collaborating and trying to assess her situation and trying to figure out what should be done. They unwrap me hand and foot, the big striptease. Ladies, gentlemen, ladies, these are my hands, my knees, I may be skin and bone. So she's referring to this as a striptease. Once again, in a hospital setting, you might be dressed in just one of those little, shifts, a hospital covering that barely covers your body, and so you feel somewhat vulnerable. And as I said, the image of the voyeur, people looking at you in in an invasive way. We saw that in Seamus Heaney's poem Punishment, when he talked about being a voyeur. But here we have a voyeurism as well, where all these doctors are looking at her, and of course she's talking about doing a striptease. Clearly the context of this poem is very much anti-male. There's a strong current, a feminist current, where this patriarchal society defined by hair doctor, hair enemy, all of those honorifics are all of those relating to men, that they've kind of intruded on her. And so again, the image of the striptease, once again coming back to something we saw in Margaret Atwood's Helen of Troy does countertop dancing, the idea of taking your clothes off for these people to watch. That is an invasive and intrusive act here, metaphorically done, right? She's not doing it as a titillating exercise, an erotic thing, but that they're basically, denying her independence and her agency and looking at her as a thing. So she talks a little bit about the episodes that she's had in the past, these various attempts at suicide. The first time it was an accident when she was 10. The second time she meant to last it out. She rocked shut as a seashell. They had to call and pick the worms off me like sticky pearls. I believe she tried to take an overdose of sleeping pills, and she ended up underneath her house, and there were all sorts of, I don't know if it was worms or something crawling all over her, and that was the reality there. She talks in sort of almost laudatory terms about it. Dying is an art. Like everything else, I do it exceptionally well. And here we have again this repetition of I do, I do, I do. It's easy, it's easy. That's kind of curious. I do is associated with the wedding vow, and when you make your vows of permanence to your beloved in front of the eyes of the church and the eyes of the public, that's your affirmation. And here she's sort of alluding back to uh, her her abilities and her exceptional abilities as a gifted young student, the things that she does well. Plath, when she was young, she won prizes for writing, and she was always at the head of her class and always seen as a kind of a little bit of a protege. So this self-assuredness and self-confidence could again be an element of autobiography. The poems, both of the poems that we're looking at today, have a very strong autobiographical current to them. This one, where it's dealing with her suicidal tendencies, and the other one, Daddy, where she's really dealing with some of her issues, both with her father and with her ex-husband, Ted Hughes, that really traumatized her. And so that might be relevant here because she's obviously psychologically damaged and seeing herself in this very vulnerable position where they're all just gawking at her. But of course, within that situation where you have these people crowded around her, trying to get a look at her, she starts to realize that she's almost a bit of a celebrity, and there's a sort of a theatricality to it that she's manipulating and playing with. And so the figure towards the end of the poem, even though she's put upon, she's also dynamic and energetic. She has a whole lot of force behind her. So it's the theatrical comeback in broad day to that same place, the same face, the same brute amused shout. These suicide attempts where she's kind of gone and then she comes back. And when she comes back, she's typically being observed by people who are trying to either resuscitate her or assess her psychological state. A miracle. Once again, Lazarus is known as one of Jesus's miracles, bringing back this person from the dead. And these doctors have a miraculous quality to them. What's interesting is there's a sense, obviously the suicidal attempt, that it's an undesired miraculous intervention. The amused shout, a miracle that knocks me out. There is a charge for the eyeing of my scars. There is a charge for the hearing of my heart. It really goes. There is a charge, a very large charge, for a word or a touch or a bit of blood or a piece of my hair or my clothes. So there's these charges, okay, and charge could be two things. It could be an electrical charge, which has a place in mental health intervention, particularly in this time. But also there's a charge as in a fee that you pay. And it's almost like she's a carnival barker or some vaudevillian, that she's charging for this show that she's putting on. And the show is to see little bits and pieces of her, the eyeing of her scars, the hearing of her heart, okay, a touch, a word, or a bit of blood. Those last references, a bit of blood or a piece of my hair or my clothes, that starts to make a curious image of religious relics. The saints in early Christianity, you had pieces of the bodies of some of the early saints that were sanctified, and very often you had them in churches, and people would go and stand in line and touch them, and so you'd have St. John's thigh bone or something, and people would go and rub it and feel that it would be give them good luck and give them some sort of divinity, and so there's this weird element here where she's enumerating all these aspects of her and her body, but seeing them possibly in this almost sacrilegious sense of a religious relic. And then, of course, and so, Herr Doctor, so, Herr Enemy, I am your opus, I am your valuable, your pure gold baby. It's almost like she's special to them because she's this experiment, she's this experimental thing. She's opus, right, a big work, and valuable because of what she represents to them. And then the final sequence of images bring it back to the Holocaust and the death camps in Germany. The pure gold baby that melts to a shriek, I turn and burn. Do not think I underestimate your great concern. Ash, ash, you poke and stir. Flesh, bone, there's nothing there. A cake of soap, a wedding ring, a gold filling. All of those are three references that go very directly to the death camps. As I mentioned, the cake of soap, the Nazis made soap out of the body fat of the Jews. The wedding ring and the gold fillings, those were things that were taken from the people when they came in. People used to have fillings, dental fillings with gold. They're valuable, they're malleable, and so they would take those teeth out of the people because of the value of that, and they would take typically their wedding rings as well, which were often made of gold. It's one of the concentrated places of wealth, and they would melt those down. And so that line previously, the pure gold baby that melts to a shriek, conjures all of that, this kind of very complicated iconography of the Holocaust and value and her value and her identification with the Jews. Obviously, what she's identifying with is this psychological trauma, right? A lot of critics have taken offense with this, that she sees herself comparing herself to the Jews. However, certain other critics have felt that it was a very bold and innovative thing to sort of create this poetic lexicon for herself that could bring the nature of her suffering. And actually in her letters, she's commented on this, writing letters to her mother about the idea of these death camps and how for her the torment that she was feeling made her identify and associate with these people who were also tormented and obviously ultimately exterminated. Continuing to use the German honorifics, Herr God, Herr Lucifer, okay, again, Mr., beware, beware. And the final lines of the poem bring it to the image of Lazarus, first off, but also the image of the phoenix rising from the ashes, a mythical figure, the bird, the phoenix that comes from the ash and flies out. Beware, beware, out of the ash I rise with my red hair, and I eat men like air. And so you have a sort of a strange ending to the poem, because the poem is very much dealing with suicide, we've seen throughout, but yet the final line of it is the phoenix rising from the ashes. In other words, this image of hope and power. And again, we come to the end of this, and the speaker seems like she has a fair bit of dynamic force behind her. She doesn't seem like she's admitting defeat. She's kind of manipulating the doctors. She's stage managing the situation around her, where all these people are coming to ogle her and to look at her body, and she seems to be very much in control of the situation. So there's kind of this strangely, almost an ironic ending to the poem, where this sense of regeneration. Now, of course, that goes back to the theme of Lazarus, so maybe we need to read the poem in a slightly different way, this idea that there is an element of hope to it, even though it's related to suicide, and even though we do know that she does succeed in her attempts at suicide shortly thereafter. Now we'll move on to our discussion of the other poem by Sylvia Plath entitled Daddy. And Daddy is, once again, as I mentioned, vaguely autobiographical, in the sense that Plath had a somewhat problematic relationship with her father and also with her ex-husband, Ted Hughes. And this poem kind of gets at these aspects, similarly to the previous poem, Lady Lazarus, these aspects of male domination and imposition on her life. And so you have this, once again, a sort of a feminist subtext to this poem. You do not do anymore, black shoe, in which I lived like a foot for 30 years, poor and white, barely daring to breathe or chew. It's a very strange opening stanza, the black shoe that she can't live in. It almost sounds like it's been this imposing, constraining reality. There's a nursery rhyme, Old Mother Hubbard, who lived in a shoe, and there's this sense of the feeling that the shoe is an imposition, and we very quickly associate it with the figure of the father. Daddy, I have had to kill you. You died before I had time. Marble heavy, a big bag of God, a bag full of God. Ghastly statue with one gray toe, big as a Frisco seal, and a head in the freakish Atlantic where it pours bean green over blue in the waters off beautiful Nauset. I used to pray to recover you. Ach, du, There's a whole bunch of connection here, as I mentioned. The father figure, Otto Plath, had a gangrenous toe, so she's making mention of his big gray toe that he ended up having surgery on, ended up dying before she had the chance to kill him. So there's that element. Similarly, she moves towards a discussion of his German tongue, which we mentioned previously, that because she was growing up in Boston, Massachusetts, during the time of World War II, when the Americans were at war with the Germans, her father's speaking German would have been a fairly problematic issue for her. So we see ich, and ach, du, and you see a number of other references to the German tongue. She makes mention of it, that connecting it to a Polish town, scraped flat by the roller of wars. So we see again this issue of World War II, the connection there, the Germans invading Poland, Hitler and his whole element, his whole itinerary of world domination. And so everything about the language that she grew up with is disturbing to her. It's stuck in a barbed wire snare. Ich. I could hardly speak, right? Ich is I in German. I could hardly speak. I thought every German was you, and the language obscene. An engine, chuffing me off like a Jew to Dachau, Auschwitz, Belsen. I began to talk like a Jew. I think I may well be a Jew. So again, this strong identification with the Jews, being oppressed by the Germans. Her father is part of this figure of oppression. The snows of the Tyrol, the clear beer of Vienna are not very pure or true. With my gypsy ancestress and my weird luck, and my tarot pack, I may be a bit of a Jew. Once again, reference here to the gypsies, another group that the Nazis saw as worthy of extermination. They were rounded up, the Roma people in Europe, in certain parts of Eastern Europe, and they were exterminated in great numbers. Lesser numbers than the Jews because there were fewer of them around. But here, so she's identifying with the tarot cards and the gypsy ancestress. I have always been scared of you with your Luftwaffe, your gobbledygook, and your neat mustache, and your Aryan eye, bright blue, Panzerman. Again, the Luftwaffe was the Nazi Air Force. Panzers were the Nazi tanks that they used in battle. So she's making a very strong relation with her father to the Nazis and herself to the Jew. So we have this, again, complicated psychological portrait that she's painting for us, where she's, this oppressed being, and her father, who died when she was young, is partially responsible. Not God, but a swastika so black no sky could squeak through. Every woman adores a fascist, the boot in the face, the brute heart of a brute like you. You stand at the blackboard, Daddy, and the picture I have of you, a cleft in your chin instead of your foot, but no less a devil for that, no, not any less the black man who bit my pretty red heart in two. I was 10 when they buried you. At 20, I tried to die and get back to you. But I thought even the bones would do. But they pulled me out of a sack and they stuck me together with glue, and then I knew what to do. I made a model of you, a man in black with a Mein Kampf look and a love of the rack and the screw. And I said, I do. Here she's referring to her marriage with Ted Hughes, as I said, a relatively well-known British poet. Apparently they had a rather volatile relationship. The way she's classifying him, she's equating him to her father, a man in black with a Mein Kampf look. Mein Kampf is Hitler's famous work that he wrote, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. And so she's equating him to Hitler. She's equating him to her father, the things that have done. We see her referencing her attempts at suicide when she was 10 and when she was 20, the time when her father died. We start to get a fuller picture of the really complex psychological landscape that she's lived. And of course, her husband is not only a Nazi, but he's a torturer, a love of the rack and the screw. And I said, I do, I do. So she married this person who it turns out is a horrible person in the end. And so in the latter stages of this poem, she's basically going back over that relationship, kind of talking back again her father who is dead, who's passed away, and she's feeling this need to sort of communicate with him and rant almost. It's a very, it's a vitriolic poem, again, connecting to this, all this very horrific, macabre imagery. If I've killed one man, I've killed two. The vampire who said he was you and drank my blood for a year, 7 years if you want to know. Again, her marriage to Ted Hughes lasted 7 years. He's now a vampire who drank her blood for those years, who lived off of her, sustained himself off of her. Daddy, you can lie back now. There's a stake in your fat black heart, and the villagers never liked you. They're dancing and stamping on you. They always knew it was you. Daddy, daddy, you bastard, I'm through. Again, really, really harsh poem, conjuring her father, her dead, deceased father, almost angry with him for having abandoned her. Certainly, when we talk about daddy issues, there are a lot of them here. It's not clear to what extent, historically speaking, I don't believe her father was a horrific, authoritarian, violent person. But I think that having had him pass away when she was 10, her images and also his illness, and then having a relatively traumatic marriage, that according to her, there are some strong parallels between the husband that she chose and the father that she was trying to replace. So once again, there's another vein of poetry around the time that Plath is writing. Another couple famous Boston area poets, most notably Robert Lowell and Elizabeth Bishop, what's called confessional poetry. And Lowell wrote a book called Life Studies that really addresses this personal anxieties. A lot of people have, relatively difficult lives at an emotional level. Certainly Plath was one of them. Lowell was another one. These are people who've been in mental hospitals, who have suffered, all sorts of traumas. And Lowell's Life Studies brings those traumas, those personal traumas, to the forefront. Similarly, the Romantics, when we look back, the Romantics were always talking about these intense experiences that you would then distill into poetry. The intense experiences they were talking about were appreciation of the sublime and the natural world. The confessional poets of the 1960s, those intense experiences were elements of mental illness and various traumas associated with them. And so Plath's Daddy and Lady Lazarus, to a certain extent, both fit into that vein. So there we have a relatively brisk run-through of Plath's Daddy. There's a lot that could be said about that poem, but I don't want to burden you with hours of testimony on it. So we will end our video lecture here. So have a nice day.